Howdy, and welcome to But Have You Heard About, where I and a guest, Courtney is your host, talk about a new historically based topic. My guests will be presented with 3 topics to choose from. One is a topic for them, one is a shared interest of ours, and the last is for me, because I definitely love hearing the sound of my own voice. Today is my amazing friend, Victoria. Victoria, say what up.
Hey, howdy.
Yeah. So I'm super excited. We have 3 really cool topics for you to choose from today. So our first one is anything for Selena.
Whoop, whoop.
Our second one is I protest, you protest, we all protesting. And the third one that apparently no one will ever pick, and that's, I guess, okay with me, is I still know nothing about the Know Nothing Party. Victoria, since you are my guest and you are a guest in my home, aka my podcast, what topic would you like to talk about today?
I mean, I'm prone to saying I protest, you protest, we all protesting.
Yes. With the climate we're living in now, protesting is not new, especially in the US. I mean, we literally got rid of a king because we protested by dumping tea, but nobody needs to rehear like the 10 years that you had to listen to American history. So I think it would be really cool to talk about 2 awesome protests that got us a lot of progress in their movements. So for first starters, I would love to talk about the New York Shirtwaist Strike / uprising of 20,000 people, which happened in 1909. And if you are not as smart as me, well, actually, I was not smart because I didn't know what a shirtwaist was. It is a blouse. I'm just being honest. I didn't know what a shirtwaist was. But anyways, this whole strike was in 1909, and it's about blouse making, which when you think of factories and you think especially of clothing in the early 1900s, I think of mostly women. Mm-hmm. I don't know about you, Victoria. For whatever reason, not for whatever reason, but definitely because of money, men had most, if not all of the higher paying jobs in the shirt waist industry in those factories. So you had what was called like a learner, which is like basically your starter position. And you would have young women going into these positions and they would get like $3 or $4 a week. And they would never move out of the learner positions because F capitalism, they were like, well, you're a young woman. Once you're married, you're going to leave anyways. Mm-hmm. So we're not going to promote you. And so they would always promote men who, when they're in the top positions, are getting $20-something a week, but they would literally be pushing their work to those learners. And then they would pay the learners $4 when they're getting 20-something, which never made any sense to me. And the majority of women, because this happened in New York, the majority of women that held those learner positions were either Jewish immigrants as well as Italian immigrants. And mostly the Jewish women, when they would marry, they'd be like, I'm out of here. I'm going to go be a wife and a mom. But the majority of the Italian women actually stayed around. So they were originally started with some small strikes, and they were against 3 of the top factories of the time. And when those strikes occurred, they didn't necessarily coordinate everything. They weren't all for the same reasonings and whatnot, but they did have similarities and grievances, which was the wages, because obviously $4 versus $20 a week is astronomical, especially like in 1909. The hours they worked, which were insane. You're an unmarried woman. How are you going to go get yourself a husband so you don't have to work no more if you're working like 90 hours a week? For heaven's sake, you can't win. And then workplace safety and literally the BS that women had to deal with from men in the workplace. They were like, I'm done with this. No more sexual harassment. No more telling me I can't do something because I'm a woman when I literally can do the same stuff as you. And, you know, while we didn't have Rosie the Riveter in 1909, you still had women that were like, I literally can thread a needle too. Don't tell me what I can and can't do. Mm-hmm. So as always, fuck the patriarchy. But that's just, you know, my longstanding tradition. So when these 3 factories started, they weren't the 20,000. They were small. And when they originally started, they faced a lot of hostility from the manufacturers, the police, and the courts. My favorite thing that I read is that literally the manufacturers would hire prostitutes to go in and abuse the women in the picket lines.
Right? Isn't that insane?
I was like, what are they going to do? I was like, you're paying a prostitute to not do their prostitute things. And I'm like, look, I'm all about making money. So if somebody wanted to pay me to go be an actress and just stand on the side of the road and be like, what up? I'd be down. But I'm like, you're paying prostitutes in New York City because you value them over your workers to go harass. And I was just like, that blows my mind. And even like the police, there's a case where a 10-year-old girl was basically arrested and thrown into a workhouse by the courts for 2 weeks because she, quote unquote, assaulted a scabber, which a scabber is somebody who walks across the picket line. If you have anybody in your family who's ever been in a union, they definitely say, don't you ever be a scab. I don't have anybody in my family that was in a union, but I definitely would not want to be a scab. That's just my personal take. Nobody was really taking this protest seriously at the time. It took for the arrest of the Women's Trade Union League president, Mary Dreyer, for the public to be like, oh, wait, hold on. We need to have sympathy for you because Mary Dreyer, she was not Italian and she's not Jewish. And she had been a very big activist in New York. And with her, coming out and being kind of more involved in this, it gave more of kind of like a refinedness to the movement, that it wasn't just, low class people that are just complaining. It's more of the elegance, in a sense, of the people that were basically part of like the suffrage movement too. And that they're like, this is for women. So basically, this happened for like a couple weeks. The original organization depleted a lot of its funds for its strikers. And the thing is that it's 1909. It's not like many people had a lot in their savings to save up to be like, I can, go strike for a while. I can go be with people. Out of the 3 companies, one bended basically and was like, okay, we will give you some of what you want so you can come back in. The other 2 definitely were like, nah, we're just going to subcontract work to smaller shops. And even though on 1 or 2 occasions, those subcontracted workers went on a sympathy strike, but they're also like, we need to not.
Yeah.
So when that local organization, I believe it's the Local 25, they basically were like, look, we got to shut our strike down, but it would be really cool if we actually turned it into a general strike. So it's more than just these 3 places, because this really impacts the majority of women that are working in these factories, because everybody's getting paid pennies versus, the $10 bills that a man is getting. They're doing good work. They should be paid for it. We still have that problem in current day where women aren't getting paid as much as men for doing literally the same job and having the same experience and whatnot. So one of my favorite quotes, they did band together a whole bunch of people from the labor unions. From Clara Lemlich Shavelson, she had this amazing quote. It gives me goosebumps when I think about it. And she's 23, which makes me feel real shitty being a 32-year-old and not having done anything cool, let alone said anything like this in my life. But I am a working girl, one of those who are on strike against intolerable conditions. I am tired of listening to speakers who talk in general terms. What are we here to decide is whether we shall or shall not strike. I offer a resolution that a general strike be declared now. And she just ignited the audience with that very short speech. She actually got thrown in prison a couple times during the full-on 11-week strike for the actual Shirtwaist Strike. And one of the things that they were fighting for was that safety, because there's not enough safety. When we think of the early 1900s, we think of like some mass hysterical stuff, kind of like the Chicago fire. And speaking of fires, there was a literal fire in a factory. And that was one of the things they were, having a strike for, was that they wanted more and safe just environments to be in when it comes to working.
Yeah, apparently there were instances where the owners of these factories were locking doors behind them, like behind the main areas where these workers were actually manufacturing and working. And there were discussions around the fire hazard that posed, and then also like unsafe and unusable fire escapes in the event that there was a fire. And then I remember reading that there ended up being a fire at the Triangle factory, and I believe it killed almost 150 people, that fire, and they were workers. And like it being like a full circle moment where those rights to safety and being able to work safely in a safe environment ended up being the reason that these people's lives were lost. So like ended up being like a really huge turning point for that fight too. And was unfortunate because here are all these people that were fighting for these very rights to safety and then ended up losing their lives tragically.
Yeah. And it goes to show, I would safely assume that it helped rally the public around, because while you may not have been impacted, seeing people, basically being burned alive because their manager over here is like, I'm going to lock the door because you're not producing enough. And when I think you're done producing, the amount of work that I think should be done in a day, then I'll let you out. It's not like they're standing 5 feet away. They're up in like that overview layer where they're like looking down like a hawk on people. But if a fire breaks out, they for sure as hell are going to be the first people out the door. And they're going to be like, no, not women and children first. This isn't the Titanic. It's me. My old man balls are going out the door first because that's how it's going to be. Mm-hmm. And I would assume that would kind of be like a catalyst just to prove a point. And it's sad that that's what kind of was needed to prove a point.
Totally. It's unfortunate, but like tragedy really tugs at people's heartstrings and really makes people wake up to some of the issues that don't affect them. But once they see that it is, tragically affecting so many others in the way, especially I feel like fires are definitely like devastating and such a tragic way for people to go. I think people really connect to loss of life and tragedy. So for sure, ended up being that catalyst for the change that needed to happen, to take place,
Yeah, no, I completely agree.
So sad.
And so the movement itself didn't get everything it wanted. They actually did get a lot of achievements that were more of like kind of concrete gains out of everything. A couple of those would be that they had a 52-hour work week, which I know I personally would protest if I had to work 12 extra hours in a week. I'm like, look, I really enjoy sleep. Please stop. At least 4 holidays with pay per year, which sounds ridiculous now that you find any company that has less than 5. No discrimination against union loyalists. So if you're in a union, they have to allow you to be there. Provisions of tools and materials without fee. So they can't basically hold you in a circular thing saying, oh, you broke this really shoddy tool we gave you. And even though it probably only costs like, $1, we're going to charge you $5 for it. Equal division of work during slack seasons, because not every day is you're going to have a huge bustle or a huge need for blouses. So they would pass on the work to more experienced workers, aka the men, who are making more anyways, and they wouldn't divvy it up evenly. So you would have people who wouldn't get paid for a while. And there was a negotiation of wages with employees. So you couldn't just come in and be like, you're getting this and nothing. You can be like, I've had this much work. This is what I want to get paid. So by the end of the strike, which was about 11 weeks, 85% of all shirtwaist makers in New York had actually joined this new union. Basically, with this uprising, it laid the groundwork for industrial unionism in the garment industry. And also, there were men that went on strike afterwards. They were clockmakers. And they launched a great revolt because they get to have fancy names and women just get to have Shirtwaist Strike. And it was like the next following year. And other garment strikes ensued across the country. So while this is not necessarily seen as like a huge victory and win for, those women that were working in the garment industry, I feel like they protested for rights that I take for granted now. Like, to me, 52-hour work weeks and having to ask to only have 52 hours to be paid $3 a week is just ridiculous.
Right.
And even, some of the names that are associated with this, and while it was mostly affecting women, there were some men, and they were lawyers that were coming in to be like, hey, I'm going to basically bridge that divide between the manufacturers as well as those that are on strike. And while I'm 110% like girl power all day, every day, it is good to have allies.
Right.
And I look at this as, this definitely impacted more Jewish and Italian women. And while it took having a non-Italian Jewish woman, a Christian woman who was very focused, Mary Dreyer, on religious tolerance and promoting evangelical progressivism at the time, which would include like prohibition, it's good to have those allies that see when there is something going on and to stand up for it. Because it's not every day that, you're not going to be the one who needs to have help. And I think at the time, a lot of people understood that, which is, I think it's personally kind of refreshing, but we've also been striking forever for things that make no sense. Like if you think about it,
we're still fighting the wage gap currently.
We really are. And the thing is, like, I think it's ingrained, especially into women that, even though you got this job, and let's say it's like, an entry-level job that you have you are more likely to have imposter syndrome than men do. And it has to do with you're like, I'm getting paid too much to not do something. I need to be busy. When you have male colleagues that are like, I spend 4 out of my 8 hours of the day dicking off in the bathroom. So whatever. It is what it is. Like there's no way to also curb that.
Yeah. I mean, for sure. And especially if it's a fight that's been going on since before 1909, when this is how far we've come, and yet we're still fighting very similar fights, which is, it's crazy. But again, that whole idea, right, behind like some of what these women were fighting, the whole idea of them not being taken seriously because they were women and they were expected to go home and raise a family, get married, all of those things. Like those social constructs that we kind of create for women in society, like we still fight those same things, like we're still not taken seriously because people still expect that we're going to get married, pop out babies, and, eventually quit and be stay-at-home moms. Not that there's anything wrong with that. That is entirely respectable. I feel like stay-at-home moms definitely are like the true heroes, the true MVPs. But at the same time, like that's all that society truly expects out of women, I feel. And we've, since 1909, have been saying, hey, no, actually, I kind of want to do more. Hey, actually, I kind of enjoy my job. Or, hey, actually, I kind of want to do this. And they're still like, yeah, no, but you're going to get married and have kids. So, like, that's all that we're really going to expect you to do, which is crazy.
No, I completely agree with you. I find it's always weird. And I feel like this is a holdout since like the 1800s, even before, where people ask, when are you going to get married? And when are you going to have babies? Right. So if you're not dating someone and you're a woman, it's never really ever happens to any of my male friends. It's always my women friends that it's like, oh, so when are you going to get married? Mm-hmm. So do you have a boyfriend? Do you need me to hook you up with someone? Do you need me to put you on a blind date? I feel that women are just inundated with men because there's some weird stereotype that's, centuries old. That's like your only purpose in life really is to get married and then to have a baby. And if you work outside of, the home, it shouldn't be frowned upon. And it also shouldn't be, frowned upon that you're a stay-at-home mom. But I think now our generation, coming from millennials, we are very much so happy with being pet parents or being plant parents too.
Right.
Like if I could keep a fern alive, I would, but I have a cat who wants to eat it all the time. So F it, I'm never going to get plants and I'm never going to be a plant mom. But I'm happy as women, we have those choices. It wasn't even until the 70s that women could actually get their credit cards on their own without a man or get a mortgage. But even then they still had to have some sort of, they were always given worse interest rates. I feel like this is a great segue talking about there will always be protests, to talk about our second protest that we wanted to touch base on, which would be the Stonewall Riots, which happened in Greenwich Village on June 28th of 1969 in the wee hours. So to give a little bit of backstory, basically the Stonewall was a gay bar over in Greenwich Village. It was owned by the mafia, and they basically paid cops to let them know when they're going to come do a raid, so they would have less patrons there. They would have less booze on hand. And because they were paying the cops, they didn't have as much money to upkeep the establishment. So there was no backfire door. There was just shoddy sanitation standards across the board as well. But the clientele didn't care because it was a place for them to go. And I definitely wasn't even thought of during that time period because my mom was just like a toddler. I can't even imagine that time period. But for those people that were gay, lesbian, or transgender, to be out and to be showing that you have love for somebody of the same sex as you, or that you were different, I'm putting that in quotation marks, different than what the norm was, basically was a crime and you could get arrested. And so basically police would come and raid establishments that were basically gay friendly. And they would intentionally be like, we're going to lock people up. We're going to take them. We're going to you're going to get in the buggy. We're going to go down. We're going to go downtown to the precinct or whatever those cop shows say. And if you were dressed as a woman, they would make you go into the women's restroom and have a female officer make sure that you were physically a woman. Because if you were a man that was dressed as a woman, you immediately got taken downtown and you were thrown to the wolves because you were violating a law that you were dressed as a woman and you were cross-dressing. Whether you were transgender or transvestite, didn't matter in the eyes of the law at that time. And I look at this as just being just outlandish to me, because if you couldn't, like the law basically said that if you were a woman, you couldn't dance with another woman. You couldn't hold hands with another woman. You couldn't kiss another woman in public. Same goes if you were a man. You couldn't do any of those activities with another man in public without fear of being arrested. And to me, that just blows my mind because I couldn't dance with my friends that are women because technically that's me dancing with them, which would then throw us in jail, which makes no sense. And like the music of the 60s, like you're getting some good bops, okay? They're getting like, they were stealing Black music back then. So it was the good stuff. It was the start of the good stuff. That's a whole nother story. But it was the stealing of the Black music, which made it sound good. And you have just, you want to go out, you want to adventure. And as I mentioned before, it's 1969. And it's not like riots were new. We literally talked about the Shirtwaist Riot earlier in New York, 60 odd years before. However, while the Stonewall Riot wasn't the first riot involving gay and lesbians, because it happened during the Vietnam protests, civil rights and gender equality protests and just unrest going on in the country, it took more of an active action on protesting as well as politics. Normally, there would be a day worth of protest after a big event. And normally, when a lot of people reflect back on Stonewall that are part of the LGBTQ community that are of that generation, a lot of them like to say that they were there. And there's been historians that were like, yeah, so if everybody who was there that's like said they were there were actually there, it would be like, it would fill the Yankee Stadium, not the streets of Greenwich Village. But I think it's such a monumental point in history for the LGBTQ community that it needs to be highlighted and everybody wants to be a part of it, especially if you could have been there. So going back to like the story of Stonewall, they're over here, they're roughing people up. They're taking them out to the cars. They're putting them in those like big compact truck thing.
Paddy wagon.
There we go. I was like, it starts with a P, but it's not police caddy. That's my new word for paddy wagons, police caddy. They get the fancy Cadillac, but it's not a Cadillac. So they're getting put in that paddy wagon and they're being taken downtown. There's a lesbian who is basically being manhandled by a male police officer. He is fondling her. He is harassing her, which that's not acceptable in this day and age. It was never acceptable to begin with. But because she's a lesbian, he basically assumed it was okay to do so. She basically lost her mind, as one does. And she basically is trying everything in her power to not get it put in the squad car and says, why don't you guys do something? Because there's a huge crowd forming. They did this on a night without telling the bar owners, like the mafia itself, that, hey, we're going to do a raid. So they had 200 something odd people. And then you have tourists around 1, 2 a.m. You have just regular neighbors because they're all on top of each other because of how close New York City kind of built itself. It's not like San Antonio where it would take a lot to cause my neighbors to go out. Literally, one neighbor goes out and starts yelling. Everybody knows what's going on in New York. Mm-hmm. And you have this lesbian who's like, why don't you guys do something? And then the crowd around just starts throwing chants and they throw bottles. And my favorite is that there is a lovely woman who throws a brick and basically starts everything off, and that is Sylvia Rivera. And Victoria, would you like to talk a little bit about Sylvia Rivera?
Totally. So Sylvia Rivera was an interesting part of the movement because she's somebody that's not as talked about. I feel up until recently, I believe I've seen a little bit more, especially on social media during Pride Month, you see a little bit more about her story, but I feel like she's not quite given the limelight as much. And that's definitely something that's purposeful, but a little bit of background on her. She was part of the Latinx community. Her parents were of Venezuelan and Puerto Rican descent. And so she grew up in the Bronx and she had a very troubled childhood. Her dad abandoned her and her mother died when she was very young. And so she was raised by her grandmother who, and I think this speaks to an issue that we have in the Latinx community as a Latinx woman. I feel like I can definitely speak to this. We see often in Latinx communities, families that are not as welcoming or understanding of different identities, gender identities, different sexualities. That's definitely a hot topic and not necessarily treated with as much respect as it should be in this community. So her grandmother was kind of not sure of how to raise her as somebody who identified as transgender. And so she had a rough childhood, dealing with these negative and hurtful things that were said to her by her family and these negative feelings towards her. and having to deal with that. And so she became a sex worker actually, and ended up leaving her home, becoming a sex worker. She started dressing in drag and identified with the drag community. And she really felt that this was something that she felt very passionately about, that feeling of belonging, right? Like we talked about, Stonewall and the whole idea of these bars were safe spaces, right? You long to feel like you belong. And so that was definitely something that she felt in her community. And so that was kind of a little bit of background about her. She was very outspoken about the idea of not giving people labels. And she felt like that was something that she didn't want to do in regards to herself or to other people. But what I think is interesting about her is that she has so many different life experiences that she related to. And in her fight to be an activist for her community, she kind of felt the importance of fighting for all of those pieces. Right. So she spoke out about, not only LGBTQ rights, but also the ideas of racism and homelessness and how the wage gap, all of these different pieces, education, all of these different pieces that affect the way that we are raised and the level of quality of life that we have as humans, and how all of those things kind of connect with each other. And I felt like that was something that was very interesting about her, because she wasn't just tackling LGBTQ rights. She was looking at the person as a whole and saying, like, identifying with, having experienced homelessness, having experienced being a sex worker, and seeing how all of these different life experiences affect the human experience as a human that identifies with the LGBTQ community. So I think that's definitely interesting because, right now we, especially years later, right, like modern days, we hear a lot of talk about this idea of intersectionality, right? And so I'm actually going to read that definition off of Google. Thanks, Google. So intersectionality is defined as the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender as they apply to a given individual or group, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. So I feel like this is something that's definitely surfaced again as we start talking about a lot of the movements that are going on currently. But I feel like what a trailblazer that this woman was at the time, because she was talking about exactly this concept in the 60s, 70s, like something that is still we're still struggling to understand and still struggling to make sense of this concept of intersectionality. And this woman understood it and fought for it and felt like this was something that we all needed to use as a lens for the way that we look at all of these issues, right? So I feel like she definitely was wiser than her years, I think. And so what ended up happening was she wasn't the palatable figure, right? Like we talk about this idea of having somebody that ends up being the person that society sees or relates to a lot more easily. So you think about the LGBTQ movement back in the 70s and you think Harvey Milk, like that's the name that comes, right, exactly, the poster child for the movement. And so of course a transgender woman is not necessarily the person that you think of, that you relate to, that you feel speaks to you just based on your own personal biases that you bring into the spectrum, right? So she wasn't that person for a lot of people. And unfortunately, what ended up happening was she kind of got pushed or felt pushed out because she was fighting for everybody versus the few that were fighting for themselves and the people that they closely related to. And at times that wasn't inclusive of everybody in the LGBTQ community. So she kind of felt like, hey, we're looking at this issue all wrong. We need to include everybody. We need to be fighting for everybody. And we need to look at all these ways that this disadvantage exists for our community. And so I think she kind of got pushed out, which is unfortunate. And she kind of fell off for a while. She lived a long life. She lived till 2002. And I remember reading, she had a quote where she talked about being invited to Pride in New York years later. And the whole idea of, I don't want to quote exactly, but I know her quote is something along the lines of feeling as though they were dusting her off to bring her out to be part of Pride and then putting her back on her shelf. Yeah. And I feel like that's a very powerful statement to make, but I feel like that is exactly what happened to her. You know what I mean?
Accurate. Yeah, I completely agree. It's accurate. You don't want your poster child of this movement to be, something that seems so unnatural to a lot of religious extremists at the time, because into the 60s, as well as going into the 70s, you have a lot of very far conservative as well as very far liberal values coming to light, not just associated with any sort of political party, but you have this, where do you want your morals to lie? Are they more progressive and more accepting, or are they more conservative and more of keeping the status quo? I feel that I completely agree with you, especially in her sentiment of feeling that she was basically asked to come to a pride parade to be like, we accept you now, even though you may not have felt accepted for like the past 40, 50 years in our community, but we want to bring you back to show that we are family. Everybody's accepted. But then once you come to the parade, we're not going to invite you, even though you actually started some of your own gay and lesbian rights groups that, were some of the first ones founded in New York City, in the New York City area. And for her to just basically, she was pushed aside. And I completely understand. And one of the reasons I like my podcast is because I want to bring up those people that were forgotten about. And, just going back to the whole Stonewall Riots, it was 2 days of just constant unrest, but it wasn't just gays and lesbians, drag queens, transsexuals, transvestites. It was allies as well. And I think one of the main points I want everyone to take away from this specific episode is that to be an ally is to show up and to show support. If you got to get arrested with your friends because you want your friends to have rights, it's totally acceptable to do so. And I've never been to jail. I'm in my 30s, but I'm ready. I'm ready to add my one notch. I'll go for protesting. But I feel for her. I feel for Sylvia. And I don't think, up until social media, and we're talking within like the past couple of years that I even know that she existed, and that the woman who threw the first brick at Stonewall was a drag queen and associated as being a drag queen, working in the sex trade, which shout out if you love to watch shows, FX show Pose, talking about the 80s. It goes through a lot of very real instances that happened to gay and drag queens in New York City in the 80s. Have you ever watched it, Victoria?
I have not, but it is on my watch list. I've been meaning to start it.
Oh, it has Billy Porter, and
I love Billy Porter.
He's amazing. And I feel it's a great, if you want to see art, or if you're like me and you a lot of times hate to read personal encounters, watching things play out on a movie or a TV show is a great way. And that is a very great show because it's done so beautifully. And they also have transgender women playing those roles of transgendered women.
Super important.
Yes.
Something that's like so important.
Yeah. And it goes a lot into also like the sex work that they had to do because they weren't accepted by society to even hold a job, which just blows my mind that people basically are told that you are not worth enough to have a job and to be able to have a livelihood just because of how you feel. And so, we still have a lot of those fringes, especially in religion, that it's an abomination. So I'm happy that there are allies out there. So it was 2 days of riots. Day one, they had maybe 500 to 600 supporters. Day two, they had about 1,000 supporters inside and outside that whole area of Stonewall. And it was just demanding justice, demanding for our law enforcement and our laws to not be so homophobic. And it's crazy to me that it took until the 60s, literally the end of the 60s, going into, the disco 70s, for it to basically be like, hey, we need to not be like this as a society, and we need to accept people.
Right. I mean, and yeah, to your point, there's still we still have strides that we need to make too in this area, because we have, of course, instances of trans women that are still, being murdered and still facing these same struggles that, this movement was fighting for back in the 70s and the late 60s. So as always, we have so much work to do, but it's because of these trailblazers that we're able to be at a point right now where we're far better than where we were. But that's why it's so important to be an ally. You have to be part of making these things happen. So
exactly. So the reason that we have pride marches across the country is to basically push that, there is a support for gay rights. To put it all under that umbrella, Pride Parade is gay rights, all rights Everyone is equal. Love is love is love is love. The following June, after the original riot broke out, you have your first gay pride parade. And it's basically thousands of people that showed up to this parade. And it basically hit a milestone to say, hey, you're not alone, which is basically what a protest is say, you're not alone. You should not be alone in how you feel. And I understand you. It's basically showing empathy for your fellow man throughout, the decades. Almost every major city has a pride parade. And the people that participated, and I don't know if they all know that you're commemorating the events of the Stonewall Riot and looking at, yes, we've come so far, but I vividly remember where I was when the vote happened in Texas that we wouldn't allow gay people to be married. And it was a vote. And it was just like a landslide for all, like almost no, was like that we were not going to allow it. So I was in high school and I was babysitting. I don't remember the year, but all I know is I was babysitting. And I was watching TV and they were asleep when the vote came in. And I was just like, well, that's Texas for you. It's been, 14 years later, almost probably from when that was. And while gay people can get married, there's still so many strides left undone, like you mentioned, Victoria, where we have almost unsolved murders of transgender women across this country. Even in our military with Don't Ask, Don't Tell and repealing that, it's almost unfathomable to me that it's been so long since the original riot, but we still have so much farther to go when it comes to gay rights in this country.
Right. We have things like the bathroom bill that was that was years ago. That was like a few years ago. That wasn't even that long ago. We have people who are constantly pushing these discriminatory policies because of their lack of understanding and lack of
compassion.
Yeah, absolutely. And willingness to educate themselves too, right? There's that level of privilege where you feel like this isn't something that you relate to. It's not something that you feel like you would ever relate to. So therefore, this isn't my issue. This is something that we don't care about. And we live in an era where we can't continue to allow ourselves to be those people. Right? Like we have to do more, especially if you have a position of power, Yes. So at the end of the day, if for nothing else, those are constituents too. You know what I mean? Those are people that are also voting. They're people that are putting elected officials in office. So you got to think like, if you're not doing the right thing, which there are so many people that are not, you've got to at least look at it from the lens of these people are people too. And I think that's it's huge. It's huge that we're not able to look at it from that perspective. We have so much to do.
I get to speak from a position of privilege. I'm a white cisgender woman. I'm married to a white cisgender man. But just in general, when it comes to, wanting to use my ability to speak for those that aren't always taken at full value is very important. And it's something that I didn't realize I should do until later on in life versus when I was younger and had like all the time in the world because I never studied in college anyways. Let's just be real. Any professor that ever listened to this would be like, yeah, she definitely didn't study or do any of her homework. So what was she doing? Sorry. But I'm like, I had the ability to be an activist and I wasn't. And I think we have a lot more younger people now, especially with social media, that are becoming more active and they're taking a stand for things that they believe in. And not all, of the youngest of, that Gen Z thinks the same way, which is very, it's just something that everybody needs to understand is that we don't all think the same way. Not all millennials feel the same way. Not all Gen Zers feel the same way. Same way with, baby boomers and Gen Xers. People need to understand that it's a lot easier to motivate people and to protest when you feel passion for, your fellow man. And videos and stuff that come on social media make it so much more prevalent in society, I think. So with that, I suggest everybody go take a couple Jello shots for Sylvia. And Victoria, will you join me again to talk more about protesting? Because we be protesting throughout history.
Absolutely. There's so many protests to cover that are important. I'm down.
Hell yes. I mean, if we're talking about protests, you have all different types of protesting. It's not just an actual protest in the street. You have civil disobedience. You can talk about like literally the Protestant Reformation as a protest to be like, I don't want to listen to the Pope. I can talk to God myself, which literally is so much fun. Religion is so much fun to talk about with me. I'm just saying we can do that another day, obviously, because this is going to be like probably my second longest podcast, if not my longest, which I'm super excited about. But woo woo. So with that, I want to thank everybody for tuning in and listening, talking about protesting all day, all night. And as always, cheerio and have a lovely rest of your day.
Yay, you too.